They found me 3 hours later, crouched in the corner of our kitchen, rocking back and forth, talking to people who weren't there. Blood had dried on my face, my dress was torn, and I kept asking for my mother, even though she was right there, trying to touch me, trying to get me to look at her. But I couldn't see her anymore. All I could see were shadows moving on the walls. All I could hear were voices whispering terrible things about what had just happened to me. The neighbors who called the police said I was screaming about monsters and devils clawing at my own skin like something was crawling underneath it. By the time the ambulance arrived, I had retreated so far into my own mind that I couldn't remember my own name. What had my father done to me in those final moments before my mind snapped? What had happened on that kitchen floor that was so horrific, so unspeakable, that my 15-year-old brain decided it would rather break completely than remember? For 2 years, I lived in a world that existed only in my head, convinced that reality was the nightmare, and the nightmare was real. This is the story of that night, and how a father's unspeakable cruelty didn't just abuse his daughter, it murdered her mind and left something else in its place, something that would take decades to heal and a lifetime to understand. You're probably wondering how someone comes back from that. How a girl who lost her mind at 15 is sitting here now, at 78, telling you this story with a steady voice and clear eyes. You might think this is going to be one of those tales where everything works out neat and clean, where justice gets served and the bad guy gets what's coming to him. But that's not how real life works, is it? See, what happened to me that night was just the beginning. The real story is what came after. The years I spent locked away while everyone believed I was crazy. The secrets that came crawling out of our small Ohio town after it was too late to matter, and the choice I had to make when I finally understood that no one was coming to save me. This isn't about a victim who stayed broken. This isn't about a hero who conquered evil. This is about something messy, something truer, about what happens when you realize that the only person who can put you back together is you. And sometimes that means doing things you never thought you'd have to do. I'm Ruth Madison. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you how a shattered 15-year-old girl became the woman sitting here today. And why the ending to this story isn't the one you're expecting. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this. I was born in Millfield, Ohio in 1947. My mother, Sarah, was 22 when she had me, still young enough to believe that love could change a man. My father, Henry, was 25, handsome in that way that made women at the church social look twice, and charming enough to convince my mother that the bruises on her arms were accidents. See, Henry Madison was two different people. There was Sunday Henry, who shook hands with the pastor and helped old Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries to her car. Sunday Henry worked at the grain elevator, coached Little League baseball, and told jokes that made the other men slap their knees and laugh. Then there was the Henry who lived in our house, the one who came home with whiskey on his breath and violence in his hands. I was 10 the first time he hit me. I'd spilled milk on his newspaper, and his open palm caught me across the cheek, so hard my ear rang for hours. My mother cried and held me, but she also made me promise never to tell anyone what happened inside our walls. It's family business, Ruth, she'd say. We handle family business ourselves. By the time I was 13, I'd learned the rules of our house. Keep quiet when Henry was drinking. Stay out of his way when his voice got that edge to it. Clean up whatever he broke, whether it was dishes or furniture or sometimes my mother's spirit. I got good at reading the weather in his eyes, at knowing when to disappear into my room and when to try to distract him, so he wouldn't turn his attention to my little brother, Tommy. Tommy was 8 years younger than me, born when I was 7, and already walking on eggshells around our father. That boy was sunshine in a house full of shadows. He had these big brown eyes, and a laugh that could make even Henry smile sometimes, at least when he was sober. I made myself a shield for Tommy, took the yelling and the shoving, so he wouldn't have to. In my head, I had it all figured out. I just had to survive 3 more years graduate high school, and then I could take Tommy with me when I went to college. I was going to be a teacher. I was going to save us both. But Henry's drinking got worse as 1962 turned into 1963. The grain elevator was cutting jobs, money was tight, and my mother, Sarah, had developed this cough that wouldn't go away. The doctor bills were piling up, and Henry's solution to every problem was the bottle of bourbon he kept hidden in the shed behind our house. Some nights he'd drink himself unconscious on the couch. Other nights he'd drink just enough to turn mean. I should have seen what was coming. The way he started looking at me when I walked through the room. The way he'd find excuses to grab my arm when my mother wasn't looking. The way his anger was changing into something else, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. But I was 15 years old and still naive enough to believe that fathers, even bad fathers, had lines they wouldn't cross. I was wrong. The first time it happened, I thought I was going to die. It was a Tuesday night in March of 1963, and Henry had been drinking since he got home from work. My mother was upstairs with one of her coughing fits, the kind that made her sound like she was drowning in her own lungs, and Tommy was at his friend Billy's house for dinner. I was washing dishes in the kitchen when Henry came up behind me. I'd felt him watching me for weeks, but this was different. His hands were on my shoulders, then sliding down my arms, and when I tried to pull away, he grabbed my wrist so tight I could feel the bones grinding together. "You're getting to look just like your mother did when I married her," he said, and his breath was hot and sour against my neck. When I tried to step away from the sink, he shoved me so hard against the counter that the edge cut into my ribs. That's when he hit me. Not a slap this time, but a closed fist that caught me right under my left eye. I went down hard, my head hitting the linoleum floor, with a sound like a melon dropping. The kitchen started spinning, and I could taste blood in my mouth. But before I could even try to get up, he was on top of me, his weight pinning me down, his hands tearing at my dress. I won't give you the details of what he did to me on that kitchen floor. Some things are too ugly to put into words, too ugly for anyone to have to carry in their mind. But I'll tell you this. When it was over, when he finally got off me and stumbled back to his chair to finish his bottle, I felt like something inside me had died. Not just my innocence or my trust, but something deeper, something that made me who I was. I thought it would be a one-time thing. I thought maybe he was so drunk he wouldn't even remember, that he'd wake up the next morning ashamed and sorry, and it would never happen again. But that's not how it worked. See, once Henry crossed that line, there was no going back. It was like he'd opened a door to a room full of his worst impulses, and now he couldn't resist walking through it. It happened again 3 days later, then again the following week. Always when my mother was upstairs sick, always when Tommy was somewhere else. Henry got clever about it, sending Tommy on errands or to friends' houses right before he'd corner me. Sometimes it was in the kitchen, sometimes in the basement where no one could hear me crying, sometimes even in my own bedroom when my mother had taken enough of her cough medicine to sleep through anything. Each time was worse than the last. Each time, Henry seemed to get more vicious, more deliberate about causing pain. He'd whisper terrible things in my ear while he hurt me, tell me that this was what I deserved, that this was what happened to girls who thought they were too good for their own families. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd kill my mother and make Tommy watch. And I believed him. I absolutely believed him. I tried to fight back at first. I scratched his face once, left 3 long marks across his cheek that he had to explain away at work by saying he'd gotten tangled up in some barbed wire. But fighting back just made him angrier, made him hurt me worse. So eventually, I learned to just lie there and wait for it to be over. I'd stare at the ceiling and count the water stains, or try to remember the words to hymns we sang at church, anything to take my mind away from what was happening to my body. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was bad enough. The worst part was the way it changed everything about how I saw the world. I couldn't look at my mother without feeling guilty, like I was betraying her by keeping this secret. I couldn't hug Tommy goodbye when he left for school without wondering if today was the day Henry would decide to hurt him too. I couldn't sit in church and listen to sermons about forgiveness and God's love without wanting to scream at the hypocrisy of it all. My grades started slipping. I'd been a straight A student before, but suddenly I couldn't concentrate on anything. I'd sit in math class and find myself staring out the window for 20 minutes at a time, not hearing a word the teacher said. I stopped eating lunch because my stomach was always twisted in knots. I stopped talking to my friends because I was terrified they'd somehow see what was happening to me written all over my face. The worst part was the way my own mind started turning against me. After about 2 months of this, I began hearing things. Voices whispering my name when no one was around. Footsteps in the hallway when everyone was asleep. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was just lack of sleep. I'd lie awake most nights listening for Henry's footsteps, wondering if tonight would be one of the nights he'd come for me. But it got worse. I started losing chunks of time. I'd be sitting in English class, and suddenly it would be the end of the period, and I couldn't remember a single thing that had happened. I'd find myself standing in places with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The bathroom at school, the corner of our backyard. Once even in the middle of Main Street at 2 a.m, still in my nightgown. My mother noticed I was acting strange, but she was too sick and too tired to push very hard for answers. "You're just growing up, honey," she'd say when I'd stare at her blankly after she'd called my name 3 times. "Teenage girls get moody. It's normal." She had no idea that normal had left our house months ago, that her 15-year-old daughter was slowly losing her grip on reality because her husband was destroying her piece by piece every few days. Henry seemed to enjoy watching me fall apart. He'd catch me talking to myself and smile this cold, satisfied smile. Sometimes during dinner, he'd make comments that only I would understand, things about how some people couldn't handle the real world, how weak minds cracked under pressure. My mother would look confused, but Henry would just wink at me across the table like we were sharing some kind of joke. By the time summer came around, I was barely hanging on. I'd started cutting my arms with a piece of broken glass I kept hidden under my mattress, not because I wanted to die, but because the physical pain was the only thing that felt real anymore. Everything else, school, friends, my plans for college, felt like it was happening to someone else, like I was watching my life from outside my own body. I knew I was losing my mind. I could feel it happening, like sand slipping through my fingers. But I didn't know how to stop it, and I was too scared and too ashamed to tell anyone what was causing it. I just kept thinking that if I could hold on until I turned 18, if I could just survive 3 more years, maybe I could get away and take Tommy with me, and we could start over somewhere else. I never made it to 18. I barely made it to 16. Because in August of 1963, on a night when the heat was so thick you could barely breathe, and my mother had finally fallen asleep after coughing for 3 straight hours, Henry decided he was tired of sneaking around. That night, he decided to take everything that was left of me. And that's the night I finally, completely, irrevocably lost my mind. August 15th, 1963. Tommy's 9th birthday was the next day, and I had his present wrapped and hidden. A baseball glove I'd saved up for all summer. That night, the heat was so thick you could barely breathe, and my mother had finally passed out from her cough medicine around 10. When Henry's truck pulled into the driveway, I knew something was different. His footsteps came straight upstairs to my room. When he opened that door, his eyes had a look I'd never seen before, wild but determined, like he'd made some final decision. "Get up," he said, and his voice was cold in a way that made my blood freeze. What happened in that room? I can't give you all the details. Henry didn't just assault me that night. He tried to erase me completely. At some point, my mind just snapped, like a wire stretched too tight, finally breaking. I left my body and floated somewhere near the ceiling, watching what was happening to that girl on the bed, like it was a movie I didn't want to see. When it was over, I couldn't get back into my body. I found myself in the kitchen 3 hours later, talking to my dead grandmother about why the walls were bleeding. That's where Mrs. Henderson found me when she called the police after hearing the screaming. Henry played his part perfectly, told the officers I'd been acting strange for months, that he'd been worried about my mental health. "She's been seeing things, talking to herself," he said, voice full of parental concern. When my mother came downstairs and saw me covered in blood, talking to empty air about demons and angels, she started crying. I tried to tell her what Henry had done, but the words that came out weren't the words I meant. Instead, I rambled about shadows and voices and bugs crawling on the walls. 6 days in the hospital, strapped to a bed in the psychiatric ward. The doctor said I'd had a complete psychotic break. Henry visited twice, holding my hand for the nurses while whispering threats in my ear when they weren't looking. "Tell anyone what really happened, and something terrible will happen to Tommy." At 16, they transferred me to Riverside State Hospital. My mother came to say goodbye, looking older than her 37 years. I tried one last time to tell her the truth, but again, only madness came out of my mouth. She cried and asked what had happened to my beautiful mind. Henry rewrote our family's story after that, told everyone I'd always been troubled, that it was hereditary mental illness. People praised him for being such a devoted father. Tommy got sent to live with our Aunt Helen 3 states away. My 9-year-old brother lost everything in 1 week. Henry had won completely. I was locked away, labeled dangerous and insane, while the man who destroyed my mind walked free. But here's what Henry didn't understand about broken minds. Sometimes they don't stay broken. Sometimes they heal in the dark and remember everything. I was 16 years old, and I was just getting started. Riverside State Hospital wasn't like the hospitals you see in movies. It was a warehouse for broken people, long, gray corridors that echoed with screaming and sobbing, rooms that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Most of the staff treated us like we were animals, dangerous things to be contained rather than people to be healed. But there was one nurse who was different. Clara Washington was a black woman in her 40s who worked the night shift on my ward. She had gentle hands and eyes that actually saw you when she looked at you. While the other nurses would just shove pills at us and move on, Clara would sit on the edge of my bed during her rounds and actually listen when I talked, even when what I was saying made no sense. For the first year, I was lost completely. I'd have conversations with people who weren't there, see things crawling on the walls, spend hours convinced that the government was monitoring my thoughts through the heating system. But Clara never treated me like I was hopeless. She'd bring me extra blankets when I was shivering from nightmares, slip me an extra cookie from the kitchen when I forgot to eat. One night, about 14 months after I'd been committed, I was having what they called a lucid episode, a brief window when the fog in my head cleared enough for me to remember who I was. I was sitting in the common room, staring out the barred windows, when Clara sat down beside me. "You know what happened to you, don't you?" she said quietly. "Someone hurt you bad. That's why your mind went away. It was protecting you from something too terrible to remember." I looked at her, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like someone was actually seeing me. Not the crazy girl who talked to ghosts, but the real me underneath all the broken pieces. "My father," I whispered, and saying those words out loud felt like pulling glass out of my throat. "He did things for months." I tried to tell them, but no one believed me. Clara nodded like she'd known all along. "Your mind isn't broken, Ruth. It's hiding. And when it feels safe enough, it'll come back to you. But you have to give it a reason to come back." She started bringing me notebooks, cheap composition books with black and white covers that she'd buy with her own money. "Write," she told me. "Write down everything, even if it doesn't make sense. Your mind is trying to put itself back together, and writing might help it remember how the pieces fit." At first, what I wrote was complete nonsense. Pages of random words, conversations with my dead grandmother, detailed descriptions of the demons I saw in the corners of my room. But Clara kept bringing me new notebooks, kept encouraging me to keep writing, even when what came out was gibberish. Slowly, over months, something started to change. The writing began to make more sense. I'd have whole paragraphs that were coherent, memories that were real instead of hallucinations. I started to remember pieces of my life before Henry destroyed it. My dreams of becoming a teacher, the way Tommy's face lit up when he laughed, the smell of my mother's biscuits on Sunday morning. The doctors didn't understand what was happening. They'd increased my medication, expecting me to get worse, but instead I was getting better. During my evaluations, I learned to hide how much I was healing. I'd still act confused and scattered, still talk about seeing things, because I was terrified they'd send me back home if they thought I was cured. Clara understood. "Smart girl," she said when I told her about pretending to still be sick. "You know, that house isn't safe for you. You stay here as long as you need to get strong enough to handle the real world. By the time I turned 18, I'd filled dozens of notebooks. Writing had become my way of reassembling myself, of finding the girl I'd been before Henry broke her. I wrote about the abuse, about the night my mind shattered, about the guilt and fear and rage that had been eating me alive. I wrote letters to Tommy that I could never send, apologies to my mother for secrets I couldn't tell, and eventually I started writing about what I wanted my life to look like when I got out. The day I turned 18, Clara came to my room with news that changed everything. "Your father's dead, Ruth," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Car accident 3 days ago. He was drunk, drove his truck straight into a tree on Miller's Curve." I should have felt relief. I should have felt joy. Instead, what I felt was emptiness, like I'd been carrying a weight for so long that I didn't know how to walk without it. Henry was gone, but he'd taken so much of me with him that I wasn't sure who was left. "What about my mother?" I asked. "Tommy?" Clara's face told me everything before she said the words. "Your mother passed last spring. Honey, the lung disease finally took her. And your brother? He's still with your Aunt Helen. He thinks you're too sick to see him." In one conversation, I learned that I was completely alone in the world. The people I'd been fighting to protect were gone or lost to me, and the man who destroyed my life had died without ever facing consequences for what he'd done. That night, I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. I survived Henry Madison. I survived 2 years in this place. I survived losing my mind and finding it again. Now I have to survive being free, and I have to figure out who Ruth Madison is when she's not just a victim or a patient or a broken girl hiding from the truth. 3 months later, they released me. I was 18 years old, with no family, no money, and a mind that was still fragile, but finally my own again. Clara hugged me goodbye and pressed one last notebook into my hands. "Keep writing," she told me. "And remember, you're not broken, Ruth. You're a survivor. There's a difference." I walked out of Riverside State Hospital on a cold October morning in 1965, carrying everything I owned in a paper bag. I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do, but for the first time in 3 years, the voice in my head was my own. Henry was dead. My mother was dead. Tommy was living a life that didn't include me. I was starting from nothing, but at least I was starting as myself. And that, I realized, was more than Henry had ever intended to leave me with. The girl who went into that hospital had been destroyed. The woman walking out was someone new, someone who'd been forged in the worst kind of fire, and somehow managed not to burn completely away. I was 18 years old, and I was ready to find out who I could become. I took a Greyhound bus to Millville, a town about 3 hours from where I grew up, far enough that nobody knew my story, close enough that the landscape still felt familiar. I had $17 in my pocket, the clothes on my back, and Clara's notebook tucked under my arm. The first few months were rough. I slept in a boarding house that rented rooms by the week to drifters and factory workers. The walls were thin, the heat barely worked, and my room smelled like cigarettes and old grease. But it was mine. Nobody could walk through that door without my permission, and that meant everything to me. I got a job cleaning offices at night, the kind of work nobody else wanted, which made it perfect for someone with a gap in their history that was hard to explain. While other people slept, I'd vacuum carpets, and empty trash cans and slowly save up money. During the day, I'd sit in the public library and read everything I could get my hands on. Books had always been my escape, but now they became my education. The head librarian was a woman named Mrs. Patterson, probably in her 60s, who noticed me there every day. One afternoon, she asked if I'd be interested in helping her shelve returns for a few hours a week. It wasn't much money, but it was clean work, quiet work, and it let me be around books all day. Mrs. Patterson never asked about my past, never pried into why an 18-year-old girl was living alone with no family. She just gave me small tasks at first, organizing the children's section, helping people find books, eventually letting me run story time for the little ones on Saturday mornings. Those story times changed something in me. Sitting in a circle with a dozen kids, reading them Where the Wild Things Are, or Charlotte's Web, watching their faces light up when the story got good. It reminded me who I used to want to be, before Henry, before everything fell apart. "You're good with children," Mrs. Patterson told me one day. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" I had thought about it. I dreamed about it for years before my life got derailed. But the idea seemed impossible now. Who would hire a teacher who'd spent 2 years in a mental hospital? How could I pass background checks? How could I trust myself around children when my own mind had been so broken? But Mrs. Patterson helped me figure it out. She knew people at the community college, helped me enroll in night classes while I worked at the library during the day. It took me 4 years to get my degree, longer than most people, but I was in no hurry. Every class I passed, every test I aced, was proof that my mind was truly my own again. The hardest part was learning to trust people. I'd jump if someone came up behind me unexpectedly. I couldn't stand being in crowded rooms. The sound of men's voices raised in anger, even happy anger, would make me break out in a cold sweat. But I worked on it, day by day, class by class, conversation by conversation. When I was 24, I got my first teaching job at Millville Elementary. 2nd grade. 22 kids who didn't know or care about my history, who just wanted someone to help them learn to read and add numbers and tie their shoes. Every day I walked into that classroom was a victory. Every book I read to them, every math problem I helped them solve, every scraped knee I bandaged, it all felt like pieces of myself healing. These kids trusted me with their questions and their stories and their hurts, and slowly I remembered what it felt like to be someone worth trusting. I was 26 when I met James. He was the new music teacher at our school, tall and gentle with kind eyes, and a laugh that made you want to laugh along with him. He played piano for our school programs, and sometimes he'd stop by my classroom after hours when I was grading papers just to chat about our students or share a funny story from his day. It took him 2 years of patient friendship before I let him take me to dinner, another year before I told him about my time at Riverside, though I never gave him all the details about why I'd been there. I just said I'd had a breakdown as a teenager, lost my parents young, had to rebuild my life from scratch. James never pushed for more information than I was ready to give. He understood that I had boundaries, places in my past that were still too tender to touch, and he respected that. When I'd wake up from nightmares, shaking and crying, he'd hold me until the fear passed and never once asked what I'd been dreaming about. We married when I was 29. Small ceremony, just us and Mrs. Patterson and a few friends from school. I wore a simple blue dress and carried daisies from the school garden. It wasn't the wedding I dreamed about as a girl, but it was real and it was mine, and nobody could take it away from me. Emily came first, born in 1978, when I was 31. Then Mark 2 years later, holding my babies for the first time. Feeling their tiny fingers wrap around mine, I understood something I'd never known before, that love could be pure and safe and uncomplicated, that I could be trusted with something precious. Being a mother terrified me at first. What if I passed on whatever damage Henry had done to me? What if I couldn't protect them from the kind of monsters I'd known existed? But James was patient with my fears, and slowly I learned that I could be the kind of parent I'd needed when I was young. I taught for 32 years. Hundreds of children passed through my classroom, and each one taught me something about resilience, about joy, about the possibility of starting fresh every single day. Some of them came from broken homes, carried bruises that weren't just physical, and I like to think I was able to see them in a way that others couldn't, to recognize the signs of a child whose world wasn't safe, and to be the adult who noticed and cared and did something about it. When Emily had her first baby, little Lily, I was 53 and suddenly a grandmother. Holding that tiny girl, seeing Emily's face full of the same fierce, protective love I'd felt for my own children, I realized that I'd done it. I'd built a life. I'd created something good and lasting out of the wreckage Henry had left behind. Ethan came along 3 years later when Mark married his college sweetheart. 2 grandchildren who looked at me and saw just Grandma Ruth, not a victim, not a survivor, just the woman who read them stories and baked them cookies and taught them that the world was full of beautiful things worth paying attention to. It was actually Lily who convinced me to tell my story. She was 16, sitting at my kitchen table doing homework, when she asked me about a scar on my wrist, one of the places I'd cut myself all those years ago at Riverside. "What happened there, Grandma?" she asked, not prying, just curious. I could have lied, could have made up some story about an accident, a fall, anything but the truth. But looking at her, this strong, smart girl who'd been raised to believe she could do anything, I realized she needed to know that strength sometimes comes from surviving the worst things you can imagine. So I told her, not everything, not all at once, but enough. I told her about Henry, about Riverside, about putting my life back together piece by piece. I told her that sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and that surviving them doesn't make you broken. It makes you prove that you're stronger than whatever tried to destroy you. I want you to know, I told her, that no matter what happens to you in life, no matter how dark things get, you can come back from it. You can build something beautiful even after everything's been torn down. Lily looked at me with new eyes that day. "You should write a book, Grandma," she said. "Other people need to hear this." I'm 78 years old now. I've been married to James for 49 years. My children are grown and successful and kind. My grandchildren are smart and strong and full of possibilities. Every morning I wake up in my own house, safe and surrounded by people who love me for exactly who I am. It took me 63 years to be ready to tell this story completely. 63 years to be strong enough to speak Henry's name out loud without flinching, to remember that broken 15-year-old girl with compassion instead of shame. I survived. I built a life worth living. And now I want other people to know that they can too. The truth about Henry came out in pieces, years after it mattered to me personally, but in ways that mattered to other people who needed to hear it. I was 34, had been teaching for 8 years, when I got a phone call that changed how I saw everything that had happened to me. It was my Aunt Helen, Tommy's guardian, calling from 3 states away. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, Christmas cards, brief updates about Tommy's life. But this call was different. "Ruth," she said, and her voice was shaking. "I need to tell you something about your father. Something I should have said years ago." Tommy was 26 by then, married with a baby on the way, and he'd been asking questions about our family history that Helen didn't know how to answer. So she'd driven back to our old town to talk to people, to try to piece together the truth about why his sister had been sent away and his parents had died so young. What she found wasn't what she'd expected. 3 women had come forward after Henry's death. Women from our church. Women who'd been girls when Henry was alive. They'd kept quiet for years. But when word got around that Helen was asking questions about the Madison family, they'd found the courage to speak up. Mrs. Cooper's daughter, Sarah, who'd been 12 when Henry offered to drive her home from church one Sunday. Mrs. Jenkins' girl, Mary, who'd been 14 when Henry cornered her in the church basement during a youth group meeting. And Emma Watson, who'd been 15, the same age I was when everything fell apart for me. They all said the same things, Ruth. Helen told me over the phone. They said Henry Madison was a predator who'd been hurting girls for years, and that everyone suspected but nobody wanted to believe it. They said after he died, people started talking, and his reputation in town was completely destroyed. I sat in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of validation I didn't know I needed. Other girls. There had been other girls, and they'd finally found their voices after it was safe to use them. There's more, Helen said. I talked to Dr. Brennan. He's retired now, but he was the family doctor back then. He told me that when your mother was dying, she asked him point blank if he thought Henry had done something to you. She said she'd seen the bruises, noticed how you'd flinch when he came near you toward the end. She knew something was wrong, Ruth. She just didn't know how to stop it. That phone call changed everything for me. For 20 years, I'd carried the guilt of thinking my mother died without knowing the truth, that she'd gone to her grave believing I was just a troubled girl who'd lost her mind for no reason. Learning that she'd suspected, that she'd tried in her own limited way to understand what had happened to me, it lifted a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. It also made me realize that my story might matter to other people, not just as something that happened to me, but as proof that you can survive the worst thing you can imagine and still build a life worth living. I started small. I volunteered at the local women's shelter, just helping in the kitchen at first, serving meals to women and children who'd fled dangerous homes. Eventually, the director asked if I'd be willing to talk to some of the residents, women who were struggling to believe they could start over after abuse. The first time I told my story to a group of strangers, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold my notes. But looking at their faces, seeing recognition and hope and the beginning of healing in their eyes, I knew this was what I was supposed to be doing with the rest of my life. I wasn't a therapist or a social worker or anyone with official credentials. I was just a woman who'd been to the bottom and found a way back up. But sometimes that's exactly what people need to hear. That recovery is possible, that you can trust your own mind again, that the person who hurt you doesn't get to define the rest of your story. Over the years, I spoke at shelters, support groups, conferences for mental health professionals. I always told them the same thing. Your pain doesn't define you. What you do with it does. You get to choose what kind of person you become after surviving the worst thing that ever happened to you. I still have bad days. I still wake up sometimes from dreams where I'm 15 years old and trapped in that house. I still flinch when people come up behind me unexpectedly. Still feel my heart race when I hear men's voices raised in anger. The difference is that now I know these reactions don't make me weak or broken. They make me human. They're reminders of what I survived. Proof of how far I've come. James understands this. After 49 years of marriage, he knows that loving someone who's been through trauma means accepting that healing isn't linear, that strength and vulnerability can exist in the same person at the same time. He's never tried to fix me or change me. He's just loved me exactly as I am, scars and all. My children know my story now, and my grandchildren are old enough to understand that their grandmother is someone who survived something terrible and chose to help other people do the same. They're proud of me, not because I'm a victim who overcame, but because I'm a woman who refused to let the worst thing that ever happened to her become the only thing that mattered about her. I'm 78 years old now. Every morning when I wake up in my safe house next to my kind husband, I make a choice. I choose to be grateful for what I have instead of bitter about what was taken from me. I choose to use my voice to help other people instead of staying silent about what I survived. I choose to believe that the world has more good people than bad ones, even though I've met some of the bad ones up close. Henry Madison thought he could destroy me. He thought that by breaking my mind and stealing my childhood, he could erase everything I might have become. He was wrong. Everything I am today, the teacher, the mother, the grandmother, the woman who speaks up for people who haven't found their voices yet, all of that exists not despite what he did to me, but because I refuse to let what he did to me be the end of my story. I survived. I healed. I built something beautiful out of the ruins he left behind. And every day I choose to keep living, keep loving, keep fighting for other people to have the same chance. That's my victory. That's how I won. If my story reached something in you today, if it reminded you that survival is possible even when everything seems lost, then please share it. Not because I need the attention. I'm 78 years old and way past caring about that. But because somewhere out there is a 15-year-old girl who thinks she's going crazy, or a woman in her 30s who still flinches when doors slam, or maybe someone's grandmother who's been carrying a secret for 60 years and doesn't know it's safe to finally speak it out loud. That person needs to know what I know now, that the worst thing that ever happens to you doesn't have to be the most important thing about you. That broken doesn't mean worthless. That surviving something terrible makes you qualified to help other people survive it too. Subscribe to Grandparents' Archives if you want to hear more stories like this one. Real stories from real people who've lived long enough to understand that life is messier and harder and more beautiful than we ever expected when we were young. Leave a comment if this story stirred something in you. Maybe you've got your own story of survival, or maybe you're still in the middle of figuring out how to heal from something that nearly broke you. We need each other's stories. We need proof that people can come back from the edge, that minds can heal, that love is stronger than the worst things human beings do to each other. Your story matters, whether you're ready to tell it yet or not. I'm Ruth Madison. I was broken at 15 and whole at 78, and everything in between was just me learning how to put the pieces back together in a way that worked. If I can do it, you can too. And if you're not ready to believe that yet, Then borrow my belief until you find your own. I'm so grateful you've listened to my story this far. It's not always easy revisiting these memories, but knowing that sharing them might help someone else find their way makes it completely worthwhile. To help us keep spreading these meaningful stories, please support the Grandparents Archives channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with your loved ones. I want to sincerely thank the founder of Grandparents Archives for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Stay tuned for more touching stories on Grandparents Archives channel.